Now I am seeing more and more use of technology, whether it's actual equipment like brain scan technology or nutrition tracking technology. I think that's expanding as our profession grows. Sports psychology is still a pretty niche community.
Whether it's struggling with mental health, not performing to one's best, it is very easy to internalize it as one's own deficits or shortcomings. I really just want to break down that delusion, to be honest.
Welcome to Women Talk Tech, the podcast for business professionals committed to advancing women in the tech sector.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Women Talk Tech. I'm your host, Wiese. And today, as we continue our theme on alternative tech and our alternative tech series, I have two very interesting graduate students from Boston University on the show today, Macy Tarrant and Nick Lee. And Macy and Nick are both counseling and sports psychology graduate students at Boston University. They focus on working with the LGBTQ community, particularly college athletes, and are passionate about these issues, and particularly mental health in sports. So I thought this would be a great topic because this is going to be a very odd one to say, how does tech apply to this? And I love the fact that there's so many connections that can be made here from a tech perspective. And we're going to dig into these issues in a second. But before we get going, welcome to the show, Macy and Nick. And you're joining us here today from the sunny location of Boston. Is that correct?
Yeah, it actually is sunny today, which is impressive.
Okay, good to hear. Good to hear. Now, we always like to ask people about their backstory. So let's jump into it and tell me what you were doing back in high school and what were you envisioning yourself as your future? What was the future? What was past Macy thinking about future Macy? Tell us, were you thinking about a career in tech?
Definitely no. I think I wanted to be I think this is included in tech now, but definitely like the business of people and helping people and having that face-to-face connection, which I think now tech and like how telehealth is included in mental health is kind of taking away that aspects. But definitely in high school, I was playing basketball and had this big focus on how basketball and athletics can be kind of combined with mental health and psychology and whatever that kind of entailed. And then I discovered what sports psychology was, and I was pretty interested in it, and then kind of just went from there.
Okay. And Nick, what were you doing back in high school? Were you imagining a career in sports psychology? Is this a dream? Is this something you always wanted to do, or were you taking a slightly different path?
Was definitely envisioning taking a slightly different path. Don't think I even heard about sports psychology until my senior year of high school as a concept. So yeah, for most of high school, I thought that I was going to be a lawyer. And that's just because both my parents are lawyers. So it made sense.
Okay.
Didn't really know how much of a grind it was, to say the least. So happy I didn't go with that. Or a doctor, because then there are a couple of doctors in my family. So yeah, that's pretty much.
We hear that a lot on the show when people talk about where they wound up or the path they took. It often it is because, their parents encouraged them to do something. Macy, did your parents ever encourage you to try a career in tech? I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I was pretty inclined to mathematics in high school. And I think my mom especially really ran with the idea of, oh, she's good at math, she has to go into the tech sector. And definitely pushed me in that direction. But here we are today.
And why did you not embrace it? Why did you not accept it?
And I'm sorry if I offend some people, but it's boring. I thought it was pretty boring. I wanted to do something exciting. I'm really interested in athletics. And I was, I felt like this was a better path for me. And I'm a pretty social person. And I think I have to talk to people as a job. And I think this just lined up perfectly.
Okay. All right. Well, we're going to dig a little deeper into that in a second. But first of all, I think it's important for our listeners to, if we could take a moment and just describe what sports psychology is and the difference between mental health and mental readiness or mental preparedness, which I think is part of what you do in the profession of sports psychology. So just share that with our listeners. I don't know who wants to tackle that one, Macy or Nick, but just dive in and tell us a little bit about that.
Macy, I got the textbook definition.
I knew you did. I knew you did. Nick is always ready with the sports psychology textbook definition because it's a great definition. I think it covers all the bases. So go for it.
Okay, go for it, Nick.
It's the psychological constructs or the psychological factors derived from sports, which include sport participation, sport enjoyment / satisfaction, and sport performance. That's a lot of jargon right there.
Yeah, a lot of jargon.
Okay. Put it into practical terms for us. Tell us practically how this works.
I think the best way to think about it is, and how a lot of people, when we're explaining our services to whether it's like an athletic department or maybe an athlete, we think of it as, you go to practice every day to either practice with the team or to get better physically. You go to the weight room to, practice with those muscles and to get better in that aspect. And then hours of what we provide to them, that mental performance aspect, is just like getting your brain prepared for sport. So it's just like an extra form of practice. I don't even want to say extra. It's just another form of practice because I think people see it as maybe an additive rather than a necessity for sport and performance. There's like a lot of factors that go into that, whether it's, team cohesion, your confidence, your self-esteem while playing sport. So it's just a lot of those different factors and how they add to the overall sport experience that athlete is having.
Okay, now this is interesting. So very much a human element. It's the human body, the human brain, the human athlete. How do we apply technology to this? Is this something that technology should be applied to? Is this maybe one of those few places where technology doesn't apply? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I can start off with that. During my first year in the program, because of the pandemic, we couldn't really meet with teams in person, the collegiate teams we were working with. And so tech became a really big part of being able to provide sports psychology services through Zoom and other online platforms. So for teams that I was working with, I was doing a lot of sessions, individual sessions through Zoom, doing workshops through Zoom. And I was even working remotely with a team out in Wisconsin. And so I obviously was not taking a flight back and forth from Boston to Wisconsin to work with this team. And so instead was using technology in order to provide these services that the team found to be very beneficial for them.
Okay. Does it work?
Yeah, it works. It's definitely different. At the same time, though, there's different types of creativity that can go into it. So using, for example, Google Jamboard, which is an online medium that can be engaged with, where people can they can write, they can put in tables and different figures. I've personally used that with teams before to do workshops. You can even color on it as well. You can do breakout rooms on Zoom for smaller group discussions and then bring it back to a larger group discussion. So while it's different, maybe we're not getting as many of the body cues or the body language that we'd see in person. It definitely still works. It can be very effective. It's just knowing how to utilize it effectively.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree.
Macy, what do you think?
I definitely agree with what Nick is saying. I'm pretty anti-technology when it comes to what we do and the job that we have, because a big part of when I'm working with athletes, I really use, like what Nick was mentioning, like body language and body cues. I use a lot of that to inform the work that I'm doing. So for me, it's really hard to not be in the same room as an athlete and be having that, connection and that conversation with them. I think that's really important for me as a practitioner with the client. But I know some people really rely on that telehealth aspect because it is so convenient. And especially when you're working with these collegiate athletes, super hard to find time to carve out in their day to be able to have those conversations. And like you could have many athletes on your caseload. So obviously telehealth is something that you can lean on, and Zoom is a great tool to use. But I think there are those downfalls where sometimes maybe you aren't capturing the full extent of an athlete, because right after a session, they just close the laptop. And in person, when you end a session, you can, talk about their day. What are they doing next? What's the rest of their day look like? So I think there are those aspects for sure. And I think at the very basic levels of tech, whether it's, text messaging, email, that's what our profession uses. But now I am seeing more and more use of technology, whether it's actual equipment like brain scan technology or, nutrition tracking technology that we would use to inform work. I think that's expanding as our profession grows, because sports psychology is still a pretty niche community. And I think there is so much room for growth. And I think as it grows, more technology is being added into that factor for sure.
Hi, listeners. We are so excited to invite you all to join us on Thursday, September 14th at the in-person Women in IT USA event in New York, where Diversity Q and Information Age will bring together the Women in IT Summit during the day and the Awards Gala dinner that same evening. Join us for a day filled with valuable insights, thought-provoking conversations, and an evening of networking, delicious cuisine, and pure enjoyment. It's guaranteed to be a fabulous time. To find out more about the summit and awards ceremony and to book your tickets to attend, please visit womeniniTawards.com.
Now, Macy and Nick, I know that you met at school as graduate students, and you've both connected over the topic of the LGBTQ plus community in sports, and particularly issues surrounding that community and mental health in sports. And I know you've both gone out and done a lot of advocating on behalf of this community. And I know that you've also talked about integrating technology to connect with this community. Tell us a little bit about that work. Tell us why it's important. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yes, Macy, you want to kick this one off?
Why don't you kick it off?
I think, what Nick and I noticed entering the field, and something that we realized, was a lot of the work that was being done in the sports psychology practical side and the applied side rather than the research side. Research loves to talk about, this minority group has XYZ wrong with them, and these are the issues. And it's this deficit approach of what's wrong with them in the sport, but it's never the actual other side of it of how can we help. It's just here's a graph and here's charts and here's statistics explaining all the issues that this group is having, but not actual real work that's being done in sports psychology. And so when Nick and I started the work, we did a lot of research on what is the applied side saying rather than the research side saying sports psychology to help the LGBTQ community. And there's not a lot there. I think there's maybe 20 published articles relating to actually applied work. And then further diving into what the applied work looks like, for sports psychology, it's very heteronormative, and it's very, masculine and geared towards the traditional athlete. And now, as we're seeing, as people are more comfortable and, it's more acceptable in society to come out, I think there's this boom of realizing that sports is for everyone, thankfully. But there is still a lot of work to be done on the sports psychology side on how we can actually help these athletes instead of using like the traditional approaches, because these aren't traditional athletes, and whatever they want to use with the stereotypical athlete, which comes with so much heteronormativity and, hegemonic masculinity, because sport has just been created on this masculine foundation that it's only for the toughest, strongest men. And that leaves out so many other people, including the LGBT community, who don't conform to the stereotypical gender binaries or, that masculine concept.
Nick, what do you think?
Yeah, so, I agree with everything Macy said. And something we did was we revisited the definition of sports psychology and talked about, okay, well, what are the implications of this definition? What does it mean that we as sports psychology practitioners, mental performance consultants, whatever the title may be, what does that mean our work should entail for the field? And well, if we're concerned with the psychological factors influencing sports performance, participation, enjoyment, and satisfaction, then we have to talk about discrimination and oppression and how that's happening within sports. We know that sport is a microcosm of society. And so if we're going to be concerned with all of these psychological factors within sports and how they impact athletes, then we cannot leave those things out. For example, when it comes to participation, it's especially I'm thinking of like the men's side of sports. It's very normal for queer men to drop out of sports and not want to participate in these environments. That can be tied to enjoyment and satisfaction. And if someone's not feeling comfortable within a sports environment, that's also going to impact their ability to perform their best. So while there's all this incredible and groundbreaking research coming out in sports psychology, if we're not looking at the role of identity, then it's a disservice to populations that are that their performance, their enjoyment, their satisfaction, participation in sports is being impacted by how their identity interacts with the sporting environments that they're in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in terms of tech, I feel like it's essential. Oh, sorry. I feel like in terms of tech, it's essential to include that aspect because sports psychology practitioners don't specifically go and seek out, LGBTQ athletes, and they don't specifically go and reach these communities. So the only way to, find and actually help these communities is by using technology and using tech and different platforms to be able to reach them and actually communicate with them. So yeah, it's definitely important.
Okay, so you just answered my next question, which were what are the advantages of embracing tech? And I know there's a lot of pros and cons here with respect to embracing technology when it comes to mental health in general. And I think we didn't, you've already pointed out, we didn't have a choice during the pandemic. We had to find alternative ways and people just suddenly became okay with it. Whereas, for example, we've been running a virtual office since probably 2008 and have always been online with our clients and serving people all over the world. And, it was really tough to find those companies who were early adopters to that. And then suddenly the pandemic hits and everybody and their uncle is doing it. But I think you've already, sort of discussed why you think there's pros and cons to that. And, is there an area in the mental health spectrum where you just think technology should not be applied?
That's a good question.
I'm not sure. I feel like... Sorry, what were you going to say?
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I feel like, kind of relating back to what I said before, I think it's very much in how I like to practice and work with athletes. It's very much for me, that personal connection of being in the room. That's my time and their time with them. We're carving out that time together because it's a 50-50 relationship. So that's really important to me, to be working with those athletes face to face. I'm also someone that needs that kind of social interaction. And I find in technology, whether it's, texting, email, through Zoom, you're losing a lot of that interaction where our work is based off of an athlete sitting across from us, talking about whatever's going wrong in their day-to-day or whatever's going wrong in their sport, and us trying to either come to a conclusion, either being solution-focused, problem-focused, whatever it is, we have to offer our services. And I think for myself, I feel like I'm a little inauthentic to it, or I'm losing some sort of gain in our services when you're not having that face-to-face interaction and you're not sitting across from them. But technology can be adapted and included in other ways, not just Zoom. I know we've talked about Zoom a lot, but I think there are other ways that technology can be included in sports psychology as well.
Well, you know what I think is interesting? I know both of you are mental skills coaches for a variety of varsity teams. Nick, I know you work with the Tufts men's cross country team and the Wellesley volleyball team. Macy, I know you've been working with some of the athletes at Tufts and other places in the greater Boston area. It must be important in the work you do to show up at a track meet or at a game to see not just what's happening with the athlete, but what's the environment looking like, how they probably respond on the bench. And that can't really be captured in video either. I wonder, is that an important part of what you do?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about that. It's a huge part of the work, showing up. Because otherwise, why would we expect these athletes to trust us in any capacity or to buy into our services? I mean, we can be incredible at the work we do, but if we haven't built any rapport with them, if there's no foundation for trust, then it doesn't really matter how well we advertise ourselves or whatever it may be. We have to actually be there, just as their coaches are there with them day in, day out, showing up for them. So I think it's incredibly important for our work.
Yeah, and
that's interesting, and I think that's a big difference between what you're doing and maybe some of the other areas in the mental health profession. I know that therapists don't, join you for family dinner to see what the dynamics are at the dinner table, but you're showing up to see what the dynamics are on the field or in the court, and I think that is another reason why we can apply technology, but it's about the human beings that we have to focus on. Macy, what were you going to say on that?
Yeah, I mean, that was exactly to be my point. Like, your therapist doesn't show up to, your events or, whatever's going on in your life. So that's kind of the interesting aspect of sports psychology, and it's extremely important, obviously, and especially working with collegiate athletes. That's the main thing, is you're showing up for that team and you're showing up for, whatever individual athletes you are working with, but it's also that team level that you're showing up for each and every single person in that family. And you have to show up to, like what Nick was saying, just to build that rapport. And that's half the battle with what we do and what therapists do as well. So.
Okay. So just as we kind of wrap up the episode, I do have a personal question that I would like to ask you. And it's, what advice would you give young LGBTQ athletes about their mental health and performance? Do you have any advice for them? Macy, kick it off for us.
Yeah, I mean, I think the advice that I would give is that the field is moving forward and sports are moving forward as we have, more and more role models to look at and look forward to, whether it be, Megan Rapinoe in soccer. She just is an incredible athlete, but an even better advocate for the community and is a part of that community. And as those athletes, and she's one of the best soccer players in the world. So as these athletes, gain more and more exposure, and as the field keeps moving forward to be more inclusive and, letting those voices shine, whether it's in WNBA with, Brittany Griner and her situation that she went through last year, being jailed in Russia, and those athletes just gaining more platforms. By watching those athletes, you feel more comfortability being in the space, and you're like, oh, this actually is for me, and this space is a place that I can actually be and belong and be accepted and actually be celebrated, because I think that's something that the field is moving forward to. And so I think the best advice that I could give is just, keep chugging almost, because we'll get there. And more people will continue to push the field along. But it just keep looking for those people in the field and just keep looking forward to them, because they're definitely coming.
Nick, what do you think? What's your advice?
I think it's whether it's struggling with mental health in general, or not performing to one's best, maybe experiencing performance anxiety, whatever it may be. But it's very easy to internalize it as one's own deficits or shortcomings. And I really just want to break down that that myth or that delusion, to be honest.
That narrative.
It's a narrative
that we tell ourselves. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like just a society-wide narrative, speaking like to the US, where it's this pick yourself up by the bootstraps, like hyper-individualistic mentality, where the truth is no one really does it alone. Thinking of all the athletes that Macy just mentioned, they're all incredible in their own respects. And at the same time, they have a support system around them that's enabling them to thrive, that they can fall back on. And also, even if maybe in one's like immediate sports community, if they're not finding a space of belonging, or if they don't feel like it's a family, that there are people out there that are going to support them unconditionally. And technology is one means of connecting with those individuals.
Yeah, that's good. Well, listen, I greatly appreciate both of you being on the show today. I think this has been a great topic on our alternative tech series. I know we're going to put a bunch of resources in the show notes. And I know, Nick, you've also written articles for news outlets like Outsports, Athlete Alley, and The Advocate. And I know you were also featured on a docuseries called Career Sports. And I know you've been talking a lot about this. I know you and Macy have had a chance to go talk at other universities about this community and what you hope for them. So thank you very much for the work you're doing. And I'm so thrilled that you continue to be a voice in the community, sports community, for people who probably haven't typically seen themselves in the traditional sports sense. And I think times are very much changing. And when I see some of these new role models today, I'm just in awe of the courage, that not just the courage they have, but how they are choosing to be leaders, and they're not afraid to be leaders. And I think that's truly amazing. And I hope that we can use technology to amplify that in a really positive way, not in a negative way. And I know that we still have years to go on this, and particularly in light of new technologies that get foisted upon us like AI and other things, I think it's sometimes a scramble to keep up. But I think at the most basic level, I think the message here is today in this podcast is all about human connection, and that we can continue to use technology as a way to amplify or augment, but nothing replaces human connection. And it's really important that as we move forward in a society, that everybody is represented at the table as we're developing new tech, and that the voice of human connection is always there. So let that voice be heard. Don't ever make that voice small. So thank you so much. Today I've been talking to Macy Tarrant and Nick Lee, who are both master's students at Boston University in sports psychology, as we talk about alternative tech and in particular technology in sports. I want to encourage all our listeners to please download our latest report, the Ambition Report, the research we did earlier in the spring about the state of ambition for women and how that is playing out in their lives today. We've got some really interesting findings. And for those listeners who have listened to the end of the podcast, I'm going to share something with you. Do you remember at the beginning of the podcast, at the top of the hour, Macy Tarrant mentioned that mother who wanted to push her towards tech and thought that a career in computer science would be good for her? Well, I am that mother, and I am Macy's mom. So spoiler alert, I'm very proud of my daughter and the work she's doing. And I am so grateful that she didn't listen to me and she didn't take my advice, because she's where she needs to be. Now, that being said, we need more women in tech, and we need a voice at the table. So even if you're not in tech, we need your voices at the table, because tech is designing what our futures look like, and it needs to be a future for all of us. Thank you so much. You've been listening to another episode of Women Talk Tech. I'm your host, Marie Wiese. And as always, thank you so very much for listening.